final panel of the conference. Is the volume okay? Yes, because we are off with the microphone. Okay. I'd like to welcome you to this, the final conference of the panel. I'd like to. Maybe I did get to the bar before the end. I'd like to welcome you to this, the final panel of the conference, Priorities of the Transatlantic Foreign and Security Policy, a New Allocation of Roles. My name is Joshua Goodman. I'm with the AJC Transatlantic Institute, and I'm very glad to be joined by Dr. Stefanie Babst, who is Head of Strategic Analysis for NATO, and by Jan Techau, Director of Carnegie Europe. Also, it's lesser known, but equally as important, an occasional contributor to a local radio show on politics known as Counterpoints, for which I am the host. So, some shameless endorsement there, and we'll move on to the serious stuff. Foreign policy was noticeably absent from the US presidential elections. Here at Brussels, the EU's foreign policy apparatus continues to evolve, to both praise and criticism, if we're to be fair. Nevertheless, it has also taken a backseat to the economic crisis. That being said, issues of foreign affairs have a way of, shall we say, pushing themselves to the top of the agenda, whether we would like it or not. I think today is probably a very good indication of that, or this week, with the crisis developing in Gaza and Israel, which is the reason why you're stuck with me as a moderator and not as Jason Isaacson is on the schedule. What I'd like to do here is, in contrast to the previous panels where people presented for 10 minutes or so, is have a conversation. I'll try to look at you, but it's a little awkward to talk to both of you when you're at my side, but we'll have a conversation on, as the title suggested, the priorities of the transatlantic foreign and security policy. Let's start actually with a retrospective question. I'd like to ask, how would you assess transatlantic cooperation on foreign and security policy over the past 4 years? And in your assessment, maybe use an example of a success and perhaps a failure to highlight your general argument. Jan, let me start with you.
Thank you, Josh. I think that over the last 4 years, what we've seen is something that's fairly typical in the transatlantic relationship, no matter who's president, and that is that there's a significant divide between the actual work that's being done and the atmospherics. Because when we look at the actual agenda that we've been dealing with over the last 4 years, cooperation has actually been pretty deep and pretty good, very constructive. The atmospheric change from George W. Bush to President Obama has certainly helped, but it was already in the making in the second Bush term, so it's not entirely new. But we worked together on Afghanistan, on Libya, on the Iran portfolio, and also less successfully, that would be the negative example, in missile defense. But the work is intensive and the consultations are strong, and the agenda is pretty much there. So there it's actually very, very good. I think by and large we have a very, very strong and almost boring relationship because we have institutionalized it to a high degree. We have working groups and institutions for most of the questions that we're dealing with, and all of this kind of administers that in a proper way.
Yeah, let me interrupt you there. Just ask, how do you make it then more sexy? How do you make this relationship more interesting for both parties?
I don't think that this should be the goal. I think the goal should be to keep it as boring as possible. That means to keep it as free of substantial conflict and as high as common success. I mean, all of us think tankers and journalists are looking for the sexy story, but usually in politics that's a bad sign. But let me go to the second point. When you then look at the atmospherics, there of course it was different. When you look at the 10,000 feet kind of perspective on this, because there, very clearly there's a disgruntlement in Washington about the fact that the Europeans don't get their act together, neither on their domestic crisis nor really as a very powerful partner in the burden-sharing game. Defense spending is just one issue, but it's also about kind of intellectual investment into a common Western agenda and things like this, where the Americans feel that the Europeans are not really there anymore. The big politics, the high politics, the big questions, this is where the criticism comes, despite the fact that at the working level, actually, the relationship is very constructive and good. So we have these two levels. Occasionally they meet, but by and large, we have two parallel stories going on. My overall assessment would be that the relationship was overall pretty good, substantial, but that the ball for the transatlantic agenda, to make it better and sexier, if you will, is on the European side. We need to do our homework. We need to get our act together again, domestically, but also in terms of what do we want in the world, what kind of power do we want to be, and if we have answered that question, then I think the partnership can, at atmospherical level, become even better than it is.
Thank you. Stephanie, it's your turn now. I found it interesting that Jan mentioned both, that's right. Jan's two examples of positives and negatives were Afghanistan and missile defense, both issues that are central to the work of NATO. So from your perspective, how do you look at the relationship over the past 4 years as an institution where the US and the EU sit together and discuss issues of security importance?
Well, I guess I would broadly agree with what Jan has just said. If I look back at the past 4 years, the atmospherics, first of all, was really good. Everybody liked working with Obama and Obama's team. There was, I guess, no one in any capital who didn't appreciate having a strong foreign policy and a NATO-interested foreign policy team in Washington. And yes, a number of issues that we tried collectively to tackle on NATO's transformational agenda were quite substantial and quite broad. Jan mentioned already Afghanistan. I would very much like to talk about this a little bit more in depth later on, because that's certainly one of the top stories, if I can say so, which is in our inbox. So, on both sides of the Atlantic. Libya, the Western Balkans, yes, we had a very successful summit last year in Chicago. Everybody praised that, including our hosts. I thought it was good that we were able to bring NATO back to the United States because we haven't been there for a long time, and it was the largest ever summit. And in terms of participants, there were so many partners taking place from all over, partners with which we operate in Afghanistan and the Balkans and other operations. So all that to say is the Chicago summit certainly set the bar pretty high for NATO to be able to take forward that transformational agenda. But, here comes my but, there is still considerable work to be done on a number of really important issues. And I think one should also mention that it was a good year ago that the United States started to really make noise, diplomatic noise, and the NATO shared that formally with us about their intent to go eastward. I mean, to really focus on Asia Pacific. I'm not allowed to actually say the U.S. pivot, because we were told at NATO this is not about the U.S. pivot. This is about a renewed engagement of the United States to an area, to a region, which the United States and Canada, by the way, are two.
I think you as a Canadian, so.
Are two countries or member countries on the other side of the Atlantic have been engaged with for as long as they were in. So the U.S. pivot and anything that comes with that was certainly a little bit of a, on the European side, a vote, a sentiment of what does it actually mean for us. And this question is still out there.
You mentioned just about 2 minutes ago, and I want to follow up on this point, that there's a lot of work to be done on substantial issues. Could you give a few examples of what those issues might be?
Well, if you look at the Chicago agenda, the Chicago summit agenda, we said we would get ready in order to finalize plan on our transition strategy for Afghanistan once we withdraw, and by 2014. We have started with that work, but it's clearly not yet done, and it comes with a huge number of political and logistical hurdles. And we can, talk about that perhaps a little bit more in depth. But this is certainly in our inbox, if I can call it like that. Secondly, anything that Jan already refers to in terms of the burden-sharing debate that the former Secretary of Defense Gates initiative here, in fact, in Brussels, is still somewhere out there. If you look at how difficult it is for the Europeans to come to grips with maintaining their defense budgets, leaving alone investing into procurement and new capabilities that we really need very badly in order to be able to keep our military posture and to maintain it and to be able to operate. We have agreed collectively that we would try to become better. There are these two initiatives out there which we are struggling with, to be very honest. Smart defense on the one hand side and the Connecting Forces Initiative on the other side. Two initiatives that were launched at the Chicago Summit, very much aimed at helping the Europeans to better pool and share and come up with multinational capability development, but not really that much has come to the forefront yet. And the third issue, which is also in our immediate neighborhood, is how we are coping with the crisis in the Middle East. And I think this is really on everybody's mind. NATO has not really played a major role so far, but it's certainly a phenomenon, let's put it like that an organization like NATO cannot possibly ignore. So we are waiting for our American friends to get ready, to put the new administration in place, to appoint a new Secretary of State, to get a new team in place, and then to work hopefully jointly on a number of new diplomatic initiatives, policy initiatives.
Let's keep the focus on the Middle East. And Jan, when you look at the foreign policy priorities for the transatlantic relationship, both the EU and the US separately and together, is the Middle East the primary focus right now?
Well, I think that in terms of the urgency of the issue, the Middle East, specifically the Iran case and the not entirely unconnected Syria case, are what dominates the briefings at the moment and the conversations that people are having. And I think rightfully so. I mean, this is the most urgent stuff. It has also the American presidential campaign has given this a specific dynamic because both candidates used the Iran issue to show their toughness on foreign policy issues, and so that created an additional kind of dynamic apart from the stuff that was actually happening on the ground in the region. So on the Iran file, it's generally expected that there will be another offer coming from the United States, from the administration once it's through the.
Is it through just from the United States itself, or through the P5+1?
Well, I don't know what kind of channel they choose, but it's clearly the Americans who have to give it the kind of impetus. And if that comes, that will be probably the last kind of real diplomatic initiative before a military escalation is thinkable. It has a double function. It has the function, first of all, to really give it another try diplomatically, but the second function of such an offer would be to say, okay, after that kind of offer, with a lot more credibility, we can then go into military escalation. Once we've really given the Iranians a substantial, believable, kind of workable proposal as to how we can resolve the nuclear issue, and then they say no, then I think there's going to be a lot less resistance to a military escalation than there would be now. The third function of such an offer would be to keep the pressure on the Iranians domestically, which are already very much splintered. There's a very heated debate in Iran between the various factions in the regime as to how to go about these things and whether it was mishandled, because the price of this policy has now been very, very high for them. So an offer would increase that pressure, because then they would actually have to make a decision and couldn't hide behind some kind of ideological consensus that is really not there anymore in that country. So I think this is the thing that we can expect on the Iran file.
And what about Syria, since you raised it?
I think Syria is in a sense, it's more urgent but less clear. I don't think that there is a very strong interest in really intervening. There has been movement over the last few days, obviously. The temptation to do something, the longer the situation boils and the more unbearable it gets, because it is quite unbearable, is there. Only that all military options are kind of fuzzy. And from a no-fly zone, which of course makes you a combatant the moment you declare it, because you have to defend that no-fly zone, so that makes you a combatant no matter what you want. Plus, insecurity, who it is actually that you're protecting with that no-fly zone. That makes it an ambiguous enterprise altogether as well. So even that relatively, low intrusion, kind of low risk, low price kind of intervention would be risky in the midterm. So that's not really a good option. Then arming the opposition is a difficult endeavor. The complicatedness of the situation on the ground makes military intervention very complicated. On the other hand, if the situation gets out of hand and there's this risk for a real for real spillover into other regions, which we will occasionally have here and there, that becomes a sustained kind of spillover, then the calculation might become different, and then all of a sudden very military options, even fuzzy ones, look less costly than a spillover. So it's as always in these things, it's about psychological tipping points. I think we haven't reached the psychological tipping point yet, where we make the calculation that we really must intervene.
Okay. Stefanie, since you also brought up NATO's desire, or at least interest in finding a role in the Middle East, where do you see that role developing? It's something, as Jan just described, the need for a no-fly zone. Is that the vehicle? Is NATO the vehicle for implementing a no-fly zone, or is the vision, or at least the desire you speak of, in a different field?
But I think there are a number of issues that probably one needs to distinct from each other. First, NATO is already an actor in the Middle East because of the fact that we do have partnerships with a number of Mediterranean dialogue countries, because of the fact that we had our Operation Unified Protector last year, because of the fact that we also maintain pretty good cooperation and consultation, forms of cooperation and consultation with a number of the Gulf countries. So we are already a player. The problem with these partnerships is that they are extremely political sensitive, and they are limited still in substance. A good year and a half back, the foreign ministers met, the NATO foreign ministers, and among their topics, they also devoted quite some considerable time to think about how they could possibly expand and deepen these types of partnerships. There is a lot of interest from Tunisia to Mauritania, admittedly all the way to Egypt, in cooperating with the Transatlantic Alliance on issues such as counterterrorism, cyber defense, mill-to-mill, as we say, military cooperation. Some of them are coming quite regularly in order to participate, for instance, in counter-terrorism briefings. They also share information. So that was seen as a good start. But now that the crisis has really popped up, and that there is, in Syria, the crisis, and that there is so much uncertainty regarding the outcome of the transformation processes that we've seen ever since the so-called Arab awakening, it's difficult to see whether there is a grand strategy how to bring these forward. I don't think that there is a grand strategy. It's rather a process of going slowly, prudently, step by step, in order to continue keeping these nations, these countries on board. Secondly, there is Syria. And I think the issue about Syria is far beyond whether we should go for a no-fly zone or not. I hope, we don't end up, with that. But I think the situation is already very, very much in our effect already. We are talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of refugees who have landed on the border, or rather across the border of Turkey. We have a bit more than 120,000 refugees, and an unknown number, probably twice or three times as much of IDPs in Lebanon, in Jordan. So we are really talking about also a humanitarian crisis in the first place. Secondly, we are talking about our member country, Turkey, who has taken the issue of Syria to the North Atlantic Council on a number of occasions, and has explicitly not asked for any type of military intervention from the allies yet. What they have asked for is to get a full-fledged and unconditioned commitment of solidarity, which they received. And they have also asked for NATO to update our already existing, for many, many years, contingency plans in defense of Turkey. So this is what we have started to do. It's not yet completed. But clearly, if you do an update of contingency planning, you need to take into account what's happening really on the ground. The Turkish ambassador just last week, when he briefed the council one more time about what Turkey thinks, or what Turkey wants to share, or wanted to share with the other allies about very recent developments, including diplomatic back and forth between Damascus and Ankara, is that he wanted on purpose to keep the door open to eventually come forward with a more concrete a different request. And I think we are talking here about, without preempting that, about deployment of Patriots and all. Just to make this straight, this is not yet a request, but I think it's going to come our way in one way or the other, and that's already been a sign of escalation. That is quite considerable. For most of the allies, unconditionally, they don't want to see NATO getting involved without a clear-cut mandate of the United Nations Security Council. I don't think that anyone is ready to march onward to an unknown without that there is a legal mandate behind. And the Secretary General of NATO has made this repeatedly clear that we don't want to get involved unless there is really a clear-cut United Nations Security Council solution.
Is that a spillover from some criticisms levied on NATO for the Libya affair?
Well, I mean, it's just a matter of political reality in capitals. You know, you look at parliaments in our member countries, including in my own country, you know, in our country, there is no way that the Bundestag or any other, I think, parliament would be ready to accept a military participation without having some type of international legal framework in place. And this is the same in Hungary, it's the same in Norway, it's the same even in France. So I think this is really a matter of political reality in the capitals.
Okay. I want to change the conversation just a little bit here and touch on something you raised very briefly at the beginning, but we're speaking on a panel on foreign and security policy right now, but I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the economics of it all, and touches on the panel from before. How are the various financial crises in the US and in Europe affecting foreign and security policy matters? In this context, I'm referring to defense budget reductions and perhaps the US withdrawal of troops from Europe. What is the impact of the financial crisis on foreign policy beyond simply priorities?
First of all, of course, there's less money for it. I mean, that's the most kind of forthright result that this has. The fact is that the Europeans are basically across the board cutting their defense budgets as the most measurable, sign of how they reduce their foreign policy ambitions because of the crisis. And that, of course, to the utter chagrin of the Americans. And what's even worse is that they're cutting this without even coordinating amongst themselves, which is the real, devastating kind of piece of news in this. It is being discussed within NATO, but that's always, after the decisions have already been made at the national level, and that's a bad thing. I think there's also, generally, I think a reduction of ambition in the entire foreign policy agenda on the European side. You could, first of all, everybody's absorbed by the crisis, and there's just less brain power and less time to dedicate your thoughts to foreign policy. Even though, of course, there's lots of stuff happening, but at the heads of state and government level, brains are just elsewhere. And you can see this in the agendas of the European Council meetings, at that level, that, the crisis has crowded out almost everything else. We just heard yesterday, I heard an anecdote from somebody who's on the inside who said that President Van Rompuy, just forced the China topic into the last summit meeting, just to have something else to talk about when he was actually meeting the press. So that for 1 hour they had to discuss China, even though nobody really wanted to do this.
It's interesting you say that because President Van Rompuy then went to the European Parliament and promoted how active the European Council is being on foreign policy.
No, that was very clearly his selling point, and that is to create some other kind of news. The other aspect, I think, of the transatlantic relationship, apart from this reduction of ambitions and reduction of defense spending, is that the reputation of the Europeans has suffered pretty badly in Washington. Europe is just really only mentioned in the context of this crisis at the moment. It is on everybody's minds. Europe is now seen again as a strategic issue, but for the wrong reasons. Because it is a problem again, because there is a potential spillover of the crisis into the US, and this is what they actually fear very much. So Europe is on their mind, but not in terms of foreign policy agenda really very much. To the extent that people still expect something from the Europeans, most of them are actually disappointed. There was a conversation I had with an advisor to Vice President Biden, who traveled Europe with Biden, for 10 days a couple of weeks ago, and they talked to tens of people here in Europe at various levels, with governments and also outside government. And then she said to me over the phone that they came back to Washington after 10 days, and they didn't hear one single concrete, ambitious idea from the Europeans in 10 days. And this is the kind of upper level that I talked about earlier. There is a lot of stuff happening on the ground and on a daily basis, but at that high level, at that conceptual level, there's huge disappointment. And I think that is one that has always been a bit of a problem, but because of the crisis has been aggravated.
Stefanie?
I fully agree with Jan's description of reality, the difficulties. Yet the question that we put from our perspective, from a NATO perspective, is, what are we doing about this? So we know the facts and figures very clearly. We know exactly how much individual countries spend on their defense. We measure them in terms of capability targets, of operational deployability. So we don't lack the facts and figures to actually know what people, or what countries rather, are in a position to deploy and make available to NATO operations, or even not to NATO's peacetime establishment. The way forward that nations have agreed to is to try through, let's say, to two channels. One is the Smart Defense Initiative. I already mentioned that. The idea behind to complement what the European Union is doing on her part in terms of pooling and sharing capabilities. So what we've done already a good year and a half ago, work which was led by the Allied Command for Transformation in Norfolk, is to go around and identify areas where nations could actually pool. And not pool already existing capabilities, but pool in terms of their planning, pool in terms of their procurement, pool in terms of their perhaps even deployability. And the list of those identified areas is pretty long, and it's pretty good. So it's not that there are no opportunities to, let's say, spend smarter. The crux is certainly that the really costly, the big ticket items in terms of capabilities, these remain very much under national prerogatives. Nations, be it again my country, be it French, be it the Brits and many others, they have no real interest to really pool and share big ticket items. Why should they? Because they look back at their national defense industries and their own economic interests, and then they come forward with all type of reasons why it was certainly not possible. But on the rather mid to small scale capabilities, be it medical, be it logistics, be it transport, be it counter IND, I think work has not already started. It's also progressing. So
but can you be fully successful? Can you have a big impact without sharing these big ticket items? Is it possible to just survive on this lower level?
Well, we have to see that. But if you would like to acquire a capability, a big ticket capability, as I mentioned, and you would like to do it now, you can perhaps expect it to become deployable in 20 years from now. So we're talking also about rather lengthy period of time. We're not talking about being able to produce something and pay for something that we buy today and have tomorrow. And that's probably the real tragedy, that even if the European nations would find ways to get out of their economic crisis, out of their budget crisis, even if America, I include the Americans here, would find ways to maintain their level of capability, still, we would really, really have to struggle hard to be able to maintain our military ambition, our level of ambition in the next, let's say, 10, 15, 20 years to come.
Can I add something, please?
Yeah.
The military spending is the one side of the equation, and as I said earlier, that's the one that's kind of most measurable, and in that sense, it's the one that always keeps on popping up. There's just two things about this. There's this ominous 3% thing that we've been talking about, or some people say 2% of GDP needs to be spent on this. The Estonian defense minister, in an anecdote a couple of weeks ago at a conference, said that his country was pretty much on target with the 2%. Only that 2% of Estonian defense spending is 40 minutes of American defense spending. And so that 2% thing is kind of also a very relative kind of, thing to use in that kind of debate. But I wanted to say something else, because it's the defense element is I think, when it comes to measuring transatlantic relations, is a bit it's only partly useful. There are at least 4, maybe 5, I think, foreign policy construction sites, if you will, where the Europeans already have the tools and don't need to spend any more money to really make an impact also transatlantically. We're totally, mismanaging the Turkey situation, where we have a supreme instrument that the Turks also like, which are the accession talks. It's not about Turkish membership anymore, in my opinion, because I think that's a dead project. Both the Turks know that and us. But we can use those accession talks to get these kinds of reforms going that they want and that we want. And that's
but how can you pressure them to reform when you're not offering them that reward at the end?
We don't pressure them. The point is, it's not about pressuring them. They themselves want this, but they need it as a selling point at home. This is not about the end goal anymore. This is merely about the process. And they've said this many times informally, give us this thing because domestically we want to implement reform. And they need this. So this would be one scenario where the Europeans have an impact in a strategic area. Turkey is clearly becoming a strategic player where they're underplaying it, even though they have the instruments, and it wouldn't cost them an awful lot of money to actually implement it. The same with Ukraine. With Ukraine, we have an association agreement with very clear human rights clauses in it. I'd now sign it and then really publicly hold them to it. You have the standard, use the standard. I know that's difficult, and it's not a very hard kind of thing, but it's still more influence that we have now. With Russia, it's the energy policy. I mean, we've been talking about this forever, and now the Commission is doing this Gazprom case. And for the first time, they approached this from an antitrust angle, but in reality, it's a geopolitical issue. The Russians also understand it as such. Maybe this could be the rallying point for a common energy policy. That's a bit of a fantasy kind of science fiction project, but that would be a geopolitical foreign policy approach, in a field where Europe is really very strong. And again, the instrument is already there. And then the final point, maybe the fourth construction site where I think we do have the instruments, we promised, after the Arab Spring, we promised the countries in transformation the so-called 3 M's: markets, mobility, and money. And we delivered none. We didn't open our borders, we didn't open our markets for their products, and we didn't give them an awful lot of money and support. Now, if you take the money thing out, which is the trickiest part in terms of, where does it go and what kind of effect does it have, the other two would be very strategic, tools to employ in reaction to the Arab Spring. We've put them into all the documents, into the new neighborhood policy. These 3 M's, appear there in the list, but we are not using them. So I think we have instruments. Europe has very strong foreign policy instruments, and it doesn't use them. Just imagine if we got 3 out of those 4 right, or maybe only 2 out of those 4, how much of a player that would make us also in a transatlantic relationship, and again, because we would have impact.
I have to ask, why then is Europe not using these instruments if they exist? What's the reasoning behind it? Is it the identity crisis that Europe is going through right now? Is it the divisions between people who support more of a stronger, united, single voice Europe as opposed to those who defend their national priorities as well?
No, I think it's the division, of course, the lack of unity, and in all of these questions, the calculation of sometimes many member states is that protecting their own unilateral interest ranks higher than protecting the common interest of all. And I can understand this. This is often realpolitik. They have domestic politics too, and this doesn't fall from the sky. I'm not the kind of think tanker who just sits there and laments the fact that they can't have one voice. So, but if they made the calculation and I think some of the countries that are reluctant to embrace a common course could find, if they could break just for 5 minutes, could break out of their singularly national kind of focus and see how much of a benefit that could also create for them in the long run, then the calculation would be different. But in the current situation, very difficult to achieve, obviously.
Stefanie, in NATO, just a few years ago, put together its strategic concept, its mission statement, if you will, if you want to look at it from a corporate perspective. And one of the items that was in there that caught my eye, I think caught everyone, was the priority of emerging threats. Neither of you were here for the first panel, but in the concept of security, in the discussion on security, not even on the economic ramifications, but security ramifications, one of the issues that came up was climate change. As a very serious security issue to the US and to the EU. Is this something NATO is looking at? Is this something, or even recognizes as a security challenge? They may not want to deal with it, but they recognize it as a security challenge, and if they do, is there a role they can play?
It's interesting that you asked the question because it was just last week that we had a debate with the Secretary General with a few of us, not on climate change, but on the strategic transformation that's taking place in the Arctic, you know, and the high north, which obviously entails a very strong element of environmental climate change related issues. But to answer your question more precisely, no, NATO doesn't have an interest in order to get involved in climate change for the very simple reason that nations are simply not prepared to use NATO as a tool, as a platform in order to only discuss that. I recall that it was probably 2 years ago that my former division that I led, the public diplomacy division, wanted to support a workshop, a very harmless workshop bringing together a few academics and NGOs up in Iceland to do some work on the environmental impact of changes in the Arctic. And then I get a phone call, from an ambassador, an allied ambassador, who said, you must be nuts, this is really not for you to support these type of things, and this is not NATO's business, and you should get out of that. And I'm not talking about a full 1 week big major international conference. I'm talking about a small, rather, small scale workshop. So no, there is absolutely no appetite. And the ones who push most against it, I'd say our French friends, a few, our British friends, our Canadian friends, but for very, very different reasons. But for very different reasons. I mean, coming back to the Arctic, for instance, we have 5 Arctic NATO member states, including Canada, with very vested interests, geopolitical, economic, military, environmental, etc., interests there in the high north. And yet it is Canada primarily, I think supported also by Denmark, by Norway to a lesser extent, but primarily I think Canada is in the lead here, saying this is really not NATO's business. It's all about the Arctic Council. This is our body. This is the tool that we have chosen in order to govern this type of region. So they really, really would like to keep NATO out of that. And I don't think that the Harper government is likely to change its opinion anytime soon. So a long answer to your question, no, climate change is not really in our inbox.
Okay, and Jan, do you see climate change as a vehicle for closer EU-US cooperation?
I think not. I think this issue is internationally dead at the moment. It's certainly dead in the US. It has disappeared from the agenda domestically. The hurricane has brought it back briefly, but there's not really a national debate. There's certainly no majority in Congress that would sustain any kind of binding international agreement on it. Plus, the last experience that the Europeans had with the Americans on this issue was rather sobering, when they were actually bypassed by the US at the large big climate conference. Together with the Chinese, the Europeans looked silly all of a sudden and felt that, there is an American president who purportedly has an interest in this, but in the end he cuts the deal with somebody else. And so that was a bit of a sobering experience as well. So I don't think that it really is a transatlantic issue that ranks very highly on the agenda, or is an issue where we could, score some points or, harvest some low-hanging fruit. I don't think it's going to happen.
Okay, and one final question for both of you before we turn it over to the audience. The second half of this panel is labeled a new allocation of roles. Stefanie, we'll start with you. Where do you see or hope NATO's role will be allocated to? Where do you see them playing a new role in the next 4 years, since we're speaking in the context of the EU-US relations during the next US administration?
But you're putting your finger with your question at a very, very sensitive nerve, because
it's a good question.
Yeah, it is. Because while we speak, indeed, I think the nations really, really have a hard time to think what NATO could possibly, or how NATO could possibly look like post 2014. This is really the magic deadline for us. I guess that's the same
Said something wrong?
Yeah, I said something wrong. So, no, but the magic deadline is really this 2014. I mean, the ISAF operation has preoccupied our work, our heads, our minds, our senses for so many years now. So it's very hard to imagine how we would actually look like without having to carry this huge operational burden. We will not disappear. We will, as I said, we will certainly transform and transit our operation into a different kind of mission, but it will be different. So if you go around ambassadors' places and capitals, you hear a lot of, oh my God, you know, what are we going to actually do? What would be actually NATO's rationale? I would certainly argue that NATO should certainly look at President Obama's foreign policy objectives and do its best to make ourselves, or to make us on the European side, interesting for the Americans. And I think we can only be interesting if we follow at least a little bit the strategic issues that the new Obama administration definitely will need to tackle. There are a number, we already mentioned a few, perhaps there are a few others as well. But even though the Obama administration in its first term was really a strong, how to put that a bit differently, presented itself as a strong believer in multilateral security cooperation and a strong advocate for NATO, we need to make sure that we remain interested for the United States. So to continue dwelling on what are we going to do, how would our strategic narrative possibly look like, we don't have money, we don't have strategic, really big interests at stake, we don't have ideas. I don't think this is a message that the newly elected president or anyone in Washington would fancy hearing. So we would need to align ourselves with our objectives as much as possible, I think, to the agenda of President Obama too, in order to be able to converge our interests as much as possible.
Great. Jan, do you agree with Stefanie that the EU, and I think you do agree with her, but do you agree that the EU must follow the priorities of the US and prove its worth that way?
I think what Stefanie said about staying interesting for the Americans is absolutely right. The key to this issue is, however, that this is not primarily about making the Americans happy. This is to make ourselves happy and to protect our own interests. The overlap with American strategic interests is fundamental. They're fundamental in almost every aspect. So by boosting our own capacities, by developing more of an ambition, yes, we become more interesting for the Americans, but at the same time, we do this primarily to protect our own interests. It would be better for us to do this. And then, coincidentally, that would also be better for the Americans. So this is not I mean, it's often framed, in a way that, just because we're so dependent on the Americans, we have to kind of, play good with them and be interesting for them. That is all true, but that's not the primary objective. It is really about the capacity to protect our own interests in the world. Security, of course, is not anymore the old security invasion type thing that we were talking about. We're talking about global security interests. As trade-oriented countries, we are stakeholders in stability in Asia, for example, but we can't guarantee that stability. We want it, but we can't guarantee it. Somebody else is guaranteeing it for us, and that's good for our business. So should we be in the situation where we can actually help that somebody who protects us for us somewhere else, where we can take the burden? Yes. And so, all of this is good for both sides, and I would never play one against the other here. This is a game that has been played too often in this town specifically. Play the Europeans against the Americans in security terms. That's just, not justified, I think.
And are the emerging democracies in North Africa really the primary focus for the EU now as they establish their role in, I guess, the global order of security and foreign policy issues?
I think it is certainly primarily the neighborhood, but we have a couple of issues here that are not only Northern Africa and the Arab Spring. We have Ukraine, for example, which is in some kind of strategic, middle ground, and has a very, very precarious role to play, and balances out its domestic interests in a way that it finds some kind of equidistance between Russia and the West. And we have an interest also in tying them as close to us as we can. We have Russia, which is a huge strategic player in Europe, which often the Americans don't understand very well, because they often say, why are you so cozy with the Russians? We have to, because look at the map. And so but we haven't found a real good approach to this yet. And then of course we have the Balkans still, which are really very much our homework and which are unresolved, both in terms of EU accession but also more general stability. One of the reasons, by the way, why also Greece is something, is not only for economic reasons that we want to stabilize Greece, this is also something, we can't have a power vacuum in that region that already is volatile. So we better, keep Greece on board. So there are a couple of issues there that even without, being obsessed by the Middle East alone, you could say that there are at least 4 or 5 strategic issues that the Europeans have on their to-do list.
Okay, and with that, open it up to the audience for questions. Just ask that you identify yourself by name and affiliation. Yes.
Teresa Bell from the European Institute of Asian Studies. Thank you for your very lively session. I have a couple of questions. One for Jan. You mentioned Rampui trying to stuff in some discussion on China at the end of the summit. Was that the EU-China summit, or which summit was that? I just want to clarify that. European summit, okay. And how do you see long-term Russia-China relations? And will they have any impact for NATO? You mentioned the Arctic in terms of climate change, but what about Arctic just now? Because China has like 2 icebreakers, and they're really happy to move through there, and they feel that I think they just recently declared that they are a country which has sovereign rights to that region. So how will Europe tackle this? Will NATO have any sort of role or creative approach to this new area? And the idea of the pivot, maybe there isn't even a need for a pivot because China's getting closer and closer to the Europeans. Thanks for your comments.
Yeah, let's take one at a time.
Well, yeah, thank you, Teresa, for your question. On the Arctic, you were absolutely right. The interesting part is also that we have now a Chinese presence, a firm Chinese presence in the Arctic, mainly in Greenland, in Svalbard, and they have built a research station. But it's not only China, it's South Korea, it's Japan, it's India, who have all put foot on the Arctic, diplomatically as they can possibly be, but very much driven by economic interest. That's obviously clear. Is NATO as such concerned about that? As I already said, we don't even have an Arctic policy, leaving aside an Arctic strategy. But the 5 NATO member countries that belong to the Arctic 5, big Arctic 5, they certainly are. They're certainly concerned, and I will be interested to see how, by the end of this month, the Allies will react to a visit that is forthcoming. The Norwegian Minister Eider will be in town on the 27th of November. He has been invited by the Secretary General to brief the Council on the High North. Very much to look at this Canadian.
Apparently I'm a representative of the Canadian.
The Canadians, I don't think we're too thrilled. But here we go. Ambassador Eider is going to come into town. And I'm absolutely confident that he will also point his finger at the fact that we have a number of Asia-Pacific countries in this Arctic game now. Will he come forward with a long list of what NATO could possibly do about it? I doubt that. But I think it's important for the Alliance to at least take note of the fact that they are really, really larger, geopolitical, primarily economically driven interests at stake. But the Norwegians, the Canadians, and all the rest of them, they certainly take very, very closely note of the fact that the Chinese have not only, got their research station or center rather in Svalbard, but they have also applied for a position or a status of being an ad hoc member, an ad hoc observer to the Arctic Council, which I find interesting. So, but we don't as such, as an organization, we don't have a policy.
Yeah. On the long-term Russia-China relations, it's not exactly my field of specialization, but from the debate that I see and read, there are two theories about where it could go. One is that the urge to contain China in one way or another is the one big strategic interest that the Russians and the Americans share, so that basically China will drive the Russians into the Western arms on this. One long-term projection, and the other one is exactly the opposite. Because China's main foe in strategic terms is the US, they will be trying to find as many allies as they can to weaken the American position relatively, and one of the primary ways of doing this is, combining or joining forces with the Russians, the other big nuclear power in the region. So that is the other kind of theory that people have. Where this is going, I don't know. The one thing that I picked up when I was in China a couple of months back was that the Chinese have very little respect for the Russians. They don't look at them as very forceful players. They have respect, for the nuclear arsenal and also for the Security Council seat. But as a political entity and as a dynamic kind of partner, they see them as much, if not more, in decline than they see the West in decline. So I don't think that they have, that they're really concerned about too much Russian strength on the border. But whether there's a lot of trust in the relationship, I can't really judge. Somebody else will have to talk about that. But those big two scenarios that I mentioned earlier are the two directions that some people foresee the development to go, and of course both would have profound impact on the relationship that we have with either one of the two.
Does anyone else have a question? Yes. I believe this is the third question on the third panel.
Craig River, Parliament Street. Just to follow up on that in terms of Russia, when Hillary Clinton visited Russia in the first term, she said we're going to press the reset button on the relationship with Russia in terms of the United States. Was that reset button actually pressed? Have we actually seen a better relationship over the last 4 years between the United States and Russia, between Europe and Russia? And should we still be considering Russia as a potential threat?
Ooh, that's a big one. I think the reset has not been really very successful. This was part of the outreach strategy of Obama after he took office, which was a good thing to do, I think. But has it yielded any kind of substantial kind of success? Well, two things maybe. Of course, we had a New START treaty, and we had a cooperation on Afghanistan with Russia, even deepened cooperation. So those are two very tangible, practical things. But overall, I think the agenda is not dominated by either of the two. The agenda is dominated by missile defense, and that is a subject that has actually been more of a problem than less, I think, over the last few years. And the prospects for that getting resolved are also not very, very good. So overall, I think that the trust level that has always been low between the United States and Russia has not increased significantly. I will say, however, that the ball, in my opinion, lies more with the Russians than with the Americans, or more with the Russians than with the West in general. The West is by and large very much willing to cooperate more. Modernization partnership is one of the buzzwords that we framed in Germany and in Europe. And there are other options. I mean, the reset was one huge gesture of goodwill. It is, for the most part, I think, the Russians that are not using the opportunity. And that's my assessment. So if we're looking at improved relationships, I think we should look at Moscow first.
Well, there is not much that I can add other than saying that, if you push a button, you obviously expect a reaction, and the button was pushed.
Did they have the wrong word on the button?
No, I mean, we did that, and we, when I say we, I mean this really collectively, because I saw many meetings of the NATO-Russia Council where across the board everybody underscored their commitment to really open minds, forms of cooperation, looking at proposals from the Russian side, getting the message out. I mean, let's identify areas, as many as we can, to really get business together. That was the overall strategic message that was said. But there was not really the reaction we hoped for. And now that 4 years have passed by, and if I look at the very, very concrete agenda of the NATO-Russia Council, if you look at the concrete project, it's very, very limited. We do a little bit of, again, military cooperation. Yes, we also cooperate a bit on Afghanistan. We have this helicopter training that we have identified as an NRC, NATO-Russia Council project. There is a little bit of counter narcotics training that we provide as NATO-Russia Council members, jointly to Central Asian border guards. There's a little bit of this and that. And that keeps the NATO-Russia element alive. But as Jan rightly pointed out, the big strategic questions, missile defense in particular, I would also add somewhere in the back of our mind, enlargement, relations to Georgia, relations to Ukraine. All these are issues where we're really miles apart. And it's very, very difficult to say, let's talk, let's talk, let's talk, which we regularly do. And we're all very nice to each other and very diplomatic. But there is still, this discrepancies of opinions, of viewpoints, and of strategic interests. And what has, in addition, also been quite difficult, and I'm saying this not as as an official NATO position, just as somebody who has been traveling quite frequently to Russia in recent years, the level of arrogance, that we have, that we had to encounter and indulge, however you want to call it, really, really quite remarkable. And I'm talking stateside, I'm talking ministry side, the type of reaction you get back if you say, wouldn't we like to gather then? Wouldn't it be nice to have a meeting here and there? Wouldn't it be a good idea for the Secretary General to meet Mr. Putin? Etc., etc. So the level of, reaction is really not nice. And that reflects very much President Putin's overall stance and how he sees his role in the world around him, even being on top of a swan.
So both of you, you both highlighted that the relationship has stagnated at best, but how then, and Jan, if I heard you correctly, you think that the onus on moving things forward lies with Russia, or they're more of the obstacle, at least in this. How do you then either pressure or incentivize or bully, if you need to, Russia to be more cooperative in building a constructive relationship, or is it just something you let lie?
I really don't know. This is the big question, $10,000 question, and I really don't know what can be done in excess to what we've already tried. As Stefanie pointed out, all kinds of gestures, all kinds of levels, general willingness. I guess I really don't know. I don't want to say nonsense here, but I really have no idea how we can incentivize them more. There's obviously a huge need for investment in Russia. There's a huge need indeed for modernization. The country has only one commodity that the world wants from it. It has literally no soft power. There's a huge kind of need for modernization. In theory, we should be in the position to provide what they need. But do they make it easy to provide it? No. So if there's an obvious need and we have what they need but they don't want it, I have no idea how we can actually force them. We can't.
Well, what we all hope for and hopefully also can expect and see in the next month from now is to have another bilateral on presidential level. And another meeting, Putin, Obama, wouldn't reset the entire button, wouldn't change the entire relationship, certainly not, but perhaps could help to clarify some of the issues and move them forward. And I'm thinking here about primarily the Middle East. I'm thinking Syria, for instance. I could imagine that would help. If the two gentlemen would get together and have a frank talk. But I think we should be realistic in our own expectations. There is not the great Wunderwaffe that we can, that we can apply in order to make this Russia change, only because we would like it to change.
I know there are a couple of people waiting to ask a question. I just need to ask one last follow-up, I guess, mostly to Jan. But the US, the EU, they play nice to Russia. And they don't really harp on the human rights situation there, the I guess, violations of what we perceive to be democratic practices. Given that it's not helping the relationship anyway, shouldn't then the US and the EU be more aggressive in their criticisms of practices they find unacceptable?
It's usually not very helpful to do these things publicly with the Russians because it creates more chagrin, more of an aggravation. It usually doesn't help anybody on the ground, quite to the contrary. I know, I mean, it's quite known that Angela Merkel is mentioning these things. She has her own kind of lifetime experience with that kind of stuff, so she's mentioning these things. She is, contrary to common belief, not very soft on the Russians. But of course, she has strategic interests and strategic imperatives. And so the balancing of the two is the thing. I think it wouldn't make much of a difference domestically if we just harp on this. There was a remarkable reaction in the West in the Pussy Riot case, where I don't think that the West really, was silent or was just playing realpolitik, selling out its values. But there's only so much you can do, and it's very cheap and very simple to stand here on the podium or to score popularity points by bashing the Russians on the human rights situation, which is not very good. But is it going to make a difference? Is it going to help you? Is it going to help anybody on the ground? Is it, do you develop the kind of constructive relationship that then really helps people by doing that? I have my doubts. I'm more in the realists camp here, so I wouldn't advocate, the cheap and easy moralistic approach to this.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir. And up here, we'll take two, see if maybe we can get them together.
I'm actually working in the European Parliament for the subcommittee Security and Defense. Two questions. First one, is there any room for improvement between EU and NATO relationship? We know at the working level, pooling and sharing, smart defense, it seems to work quite well. But what can we do in the future to improve that? That means is CSDP only seen as a problem for NATO or for the US, or is it something which is in a way welcome? And so we know the highly political problems like this Turkey issue. Maybe we could find a deal on that. But is it only about job sharing between both organizations, or what are the issues where we could improve the relationship? Second question, is the role of the UK, is it maybe UK's role in CSDP is mainly problematic? It's not only the UK, sometimes it's Germany, sometimes it's France. But let's take the headquarters issue, civil military headquarter, mainly a UK problem. So if we see a decoupling in the long term of the UK from the EU, what are the consequences for the transatlantic relationship?
Great. And perhaps we'll take the question up here.
Thank you. I'm Larry Edelman from Transatlantic Institute, American Jewish Committee. Doctor, this goes back to Russia. And Doctor, I agree that it does probably make sense for our President Obama to try and meet with Putin, but it would seem to me, and this is a question, Russia has been fighting to be the Russia it was and wants to have its power back. They're never going to get it, I don't think, but based on that, wouldn't we be better off to just begin to not respond to them and ignore them?
We'll take the last question back there. Thank you.
Well, yeah.
Oh, can we take one more?
Oh, so sorry.
My name is Giovanni Cremonini. I'm with the European External Action Service and deal with the European Neighbour Proposal. I have a question on values. In fact, we haven't talked much of values except at the end now, but indeed I agree. I'm not a human rights values fanatic. I agree that sometimes it's not worth making declarations and irritating partners with preaching human rights. On the other hand, both the US and the EU foreign and security policies are supposed to be based on values, on the promotion of democracy, the rule of law and human rights. So isn't this beyond tactical considerations? Shouldn't this be a strategic goal of our foreign policy? And how do we go about doing this? I mean, going back to the people to Asia, the people to Asia is of course the policy measure was announced, but it's actually a structural shift that started even earlier because of the real shift of power towards Asia. And by the way, Asia is also present not only in Asia, but also in our neighborhood, for instance, China, but other actors, Gulf states, Qatar, have increased influence in also in our neighborhood. Is a strategic support, promotion of our values, a certain view of the world, which is sometimes called Western values, universal values, but it's a way of seeing things. It is something that is worth promoting for the US and for the EU. And since given the de facto decreasing relative power of both the US and the EU in world scale, because in fact the economic and security power, the military power is decreasing, shouldn't maybe the US and the EU do more together as allies to, if they want to promote what may be considered as a common vision of the world, or are we going to perhaps change our values and assimilate more of the Asian values, some would say, or values of Islamic value, or values of nationalism, those are alternative concepts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we start with Larry's question on Russia first?
It could well be that that President Obama or anybody else would feel tempted to think about how would the world look like, if you could have the luxury of ignoring Russia. I don't think we can. Not really. We would need.
Just don't chase it.
Well, yeah. I mean, we need them for a number of really important reasons. As long as they have a seat on the National Security Council, we need them in order to advance any type of legal decisions, legally founded decisions with an international impact. We need them for the economic reasons that I don't even want to talk about. We need them because of Afghanistan. If you think about withdrawing forces from Afghanistan, we certainly need their direct or indirect support on transit routes, supply routes, etc. Okay, there are a number of reasons why we need Russia, and this is independent of the question whether we would or should embrace Russia. So, but we simply need them. I think the way I have understood the first 4 years of the Obama administration and their handling vis-a-vis Moscow was that they signaled that they were open for talks, open for getting together and really having very serious talks about a number of serious issues, but they don't want to be pushed around. And I think this is what the Russians, at least for my part, clearly understood. If I, for instance, recall this completely brouhaha, this back and forth over whether back then President Medvedev would agree or not agree to come and join the Chicago summit in May, and whether he would have a dedicated NRC meeting or not. Oh my God, that preoccupied the organization that tightly for at least a good, 8 months?
Pretty bad.
Yeah. So you may want to question that, but what I'm saying is that sometimes talks on a peer-to-peer level help to at least get clarity on some of the issues, and I hope that will be perhaps the case once the two gentlemen will meet in the near future.
Why don't we move to the question of the UK, and then we'll come back to the NATO, and then we'll finish with the values.
Good.
Okay, got it all sorted out. So Jan, UK, and the defense.
In an article that I read a couple of days ago, there was a nice sentence that says that CSDP can't work without the UK, but the UK doesn't want it to work, and so it can't. And I think that's true. CSDP is not really very valuable as such without the assets, both diplomatically and militarily, that the Brits bring to the table. But the Brits are also the strongest defenders of NATO in Europe, and they are the strongest opponents to these kinds of double structures that they feel would be created if CSDP really became an operational kind of thing. Whether, what impact it would have on CSDP if the Brits removed themselves from Europe, it would certainly be weaker, even weaker than it is at the moment. I think, however, and this is the larger kind of umbrella that's above that question, that the real competition between NATO and CSDP is not really a competition anymore. The case has been settled, basically effectively by the Libya case. There are two providers potentially of security in the European security market. One is NATO, one is the EU. and the EU is not providing the kind of security that the nations of Europe do not opt for the EU as the provider of that security in cases when they need a tool, and they go for NATO for a tool. NATO is the more flexible player when it comes to defense issues. It was able to do a Libya operation even though most of its member states wouldn't even participate and some were outright against it. Still, it could be dealt with within NATO. A similar kind of thing would not have been able to be pushed through the EU apparatus, even if the operational capabilities and command and control capabilities have been there. So I think that competition is over, and there's very, very little ambition in the member states to really boost CSDP. So the UK, even though they're the most outspoken critics of it, are not the only ones that really don't see much of a future for that.
Stephanie, if you have any comment on that, or if you want to move on to EU-NATO
NATO,
relations.
Yeah, NATO-EU, from a very simple taxpayer's point of view, is a disgrace. I think it's a disgrace. I mean, that the two organizations haven't, after all these years, haven't come to grips with really develop a form of partnership and exchange that would merit return. As a NATO official, I say, we have made progress in very modest ways, but there are perhaps additional ways, additional topics that we could do within the very, very restricted, limited framework that we have set for ourselves. We don't talk with the EU about energy security. NATO doesn't talk with the EU about cyber threats. We don't talk about the EU broader strategic issues. I think we should. We must. We should. And if it's only in order to understand better what the other side of this town is actually doing. We don't really have well institutionalized working relations between NATO and, for instance, Commission. The last time I tried to get somebody from the Commission in my old field of work to come to Zaventem, was a very, very difficult exercise which ended in Nirvana land. Nobody actually came. Yes, on the parliamentary side, I think we could also, between the European Parliament and NATO, there is scope for enhancing at least an exchange of information. But it all boils really down to the political willingness of the nations to make use of the agreed framework, as the Turks would put it. But the agreed framework is more than just talking about KFOR once a month. It must be more to be in any way credible. And that's why, as I said, as a taxpayer, I find this a disgrace. It really gets me, I think it really gets me really...
You should tell us what you really think.
That's why I have to distinguish it between being a NATO official...
Yes, we've taken the NATO test. If your placard, you're safe.
It's a taxpayer.
We'll make sure there's a caption on the video that says this is a personal statement and not
And if you
a...
first talk about, you mentioned capabilities, pooling and sharing. You know how this looks like in practice? I mean, that working staff from the EU military staff gets together with those working staff from the international military staff to exchange questionnaires about, what does the respective organization has asked the individual nations in terms of their own capability planning. So we are not even talking about joint projects, we are talking about exchanging questionnaires.
Okay, well, we'll turn to the...
Sorry.
No, it's okay. We'll turn to the final question, which I think is actually a fitting one to end with because it speaks to the purpose of this panel, the overarching purpose of the conference, which is the question of values in the transatlantic relationship and the strategy. So, Jan, would you like to go?
Of course, this is the classic question that comes up, should we be more values-oriented? Because in the end, this is what defines us as the West. And the answer, of course, is yes, but then, we can't have this very simple, straightforward, instrumental approach to the values debate. Because in the end, you need a counterpart who's willing to embrace that. We can't just run around and preach values, because then we look silly. You need a counterpart who's willing to say, yes, we want those. And, I think we have created overall strong incentives for other countries to adopt a more positive human rights record. Everybody knows that they will have a better relationship with the West, with North America and with the Europeans if they are good on human rights, and that their relationship will be, not as good if they're bad on human rights. So that is basically there. Plus, we're doing all kinds of things all around the world. in development aid, in the civil society stuff, with political foundations and so on and so forth, activist groups that we support, to actually push that agenda. But at the high politics level, it's not that easy. You can make a fool of yourself very easily by standing up and preaching values, and then the other side is just laughing at you. So it's a very, very delicate issue. It looks very clear-cut from a moral standpoint, but foreign policy is morally very difficult to conduct often. And so I would say, there's very, principled someone stand there and say, shouldn't we, we're so powerless and we're getting less powerful by the minute, so shouldn't we play our values more? No, I think we should. I think we're playing them already pretty well, and just make that the sole selling point of our foreign policy would actually be a sign of weakness, not of strength.
Stephanie?
Well, there's hardly anything I could add other than saying that I think the United States, in the past 4 years, and in particular Hillary Clinton, I would really, really like to underpin and applaud her efforts, and giving the value quote-unquote discussion a little bit of a different spin. First of all, I think her policies and her very, very forthright support for the 21st century statecraft, enabling people from the Maghreb all the way to Pakistan to enjoy the freedom of communication technologies. That was really, I think, a very powerful and very practical way in order to say, you don't need to buy our values, but we want you to be able to communicate as let's say, digital citizens, regardless of your passport, and participate in the global debate and participate in transformation processes, whether it's in Egypt or in Libya or elsewhere. So I thought that was really a very, very powerful, and for me, very compelling example of how you can use soft power, a soft power tool such as modern communication technologies, in order to make a little bit of a difference. But ultimately, as Jan says, foreign policy is really very difficult to sustain if you only play the moral card. You need to live up to what you actually said. You need to be credible in terms of tying your words to your acts.
I think that's why both organizations promoting this, and many in the room always promote the importance of holding to your values, and sometimes you have to be more idealistic than practical. Other times you have to play it the other way, but that's what we promote. We promote the shared values between the EU and the US, and thank you both, Stefanie and Jan, for, I thought it was a very interesting panel. I don't know what they thought out there, but brings us to the end of a long day, a very interesting day, but I think some might be a bit drained. I know my laptop ran out of battery, so clearly it's had an effect on all of us. But before we go, and the drinks are waiting for us outside, but Herr Stein from the Friedrich Naumann Stiftung would like to say a final parting word. So.